3 years ago, I came down to TMI and took a gateway program. Just about the time I was starting a new project, trying to develop new forms of instrumentation for the detection of psychokinesis events. And just by coincidence, one of the facilitators at the gateway was Joe Gallenberger. So we got to talking about PK a little bit. I told him what I was doing, and he told me about MC squared, and very graciously offered to allow me to bring my equipment down to an MC squared program and let his students take a crack at it, see what they could do. So thus was born PK Research at TMI, the MC squared program. Now before I get into that in detail, I want to just give you a little bit of background about our research group at UVA. As Carol mentioned, I'm with the Division of Perceptual Studies in the Department of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences, University of Virginia. I spend most of my time working in the Westfall Neuroimaging Lab, which is sponsored by Cedar Creek Institute, a private outfit that's partnering up with DOPS, sharing facilities, research-based personnel. So, Division of Perceptual Studies was founded in 1967 by Dr. Ian Stevenson for purposes of reincarnation research. Dr. Stevenson, over the years, amassed a database of thousands of cases of children who had past life memories. This was mostly in the Far East and India, Pakistan, Indonesia. A subset of these cases, children were naming specific names, places, and whatnot of their previous families, and researchers were able to track these families down and so-called verify the cases, which is pretty interesting. Another subset of those cases, children had memories of violent deaths, and were naming names and places, and researchers were able to track these down in police records and verify what the child was saying was accurate. And then a subset yet of these cases, some of the children with violent memories of violent deaths also had birthmarks or birth defects corresponding to the memory of the area of the injury. One of the last cases Dr. Stevenson was working on was a child who had a memory of being shot to death and had some birthmarks and defects corresponding to what looked like the pathway of the bullet on the top of the head, under the neck. And he wanted to take this child into an MRI and see if there was actually a track that went right through, but never got the chance to do it. So. Let's see if this is working. Yes. So, just briefly, at DOPS and CCI, we're still studying past life memories in children, near-death experiences, so-called veridical near-death experiences. A typical example of that is Pam Reynolds' case, which probably some people may have heard of. She was a woman who was undergoing surgery under anesthesia, went out of body, was floating up above, looking down on the scene, happened to look up and saw a shoe sitting on a shelf, out of sight of anybody down below. When she came out of the anesthesia, she told the medical personnel what she saw. They went, got a ladder, and climbed up there and looked, and sure enough, they found a shoe up there. So we like to collect these veridical cases. We're also looking at out-of-body experiences, which means I'm in the right place here today. Apparitions and after-death communications, deathbed visions, and where I hang out mostly, psychophysiological studies of altered states of consciousness and Psi, including ESP, telepathy, PK, mind-matter interaction, whatnot. The Westfall Neuroimaging Lab, just quickly, as Carol was mentioning, we've got all kinds of stuff going on there, 128-channel EEG. We can measure other physiology like GSR, EMG, respiration. We've got the shielded isolation chamber. We've got all kinds of little gadgets for testing Psi using random event generators and force detectors. We also have a remote agent room with video display. This is up on another floor of the building. And a typical example of application for that is a presentiment experiment we've been running for the past year. This involves showing a series of pictures to a percipient, a person who's wired up with EEG. Scattered randomly in the series of pictures are disturbing pictures, either violent or erotic, whatnot. And other researchers' studies have shown that about a second before the disturbing picture, there's a physiological response in EEG. So we've expanded that experiment to include using a remote agent. So the person up in the agent room is the one watching the pictures, and the recipient down in the shielded room with EEG is perhaps receiving. We haven't analyzed the data yet, so we'll find out. We're looking for advanced meditators, OBEers, trance mediums, hypnosis virtuosos, and what I'm calling Psi enablers. I guess they used to call it subjects. At the Pear lab at Princeton, they called them operators. So we would like to really study highly talented, selected people. In the Westfall lab, as I mentioned, we'd like to look at high-level performance. We want to identify physiological conditions conducive to success. We would like to do that in order to improve statistical control oversight, maybe improve experimental control, possibly, with a little luck, resolve so-called source ambiguities. In other words, in the parapsychological arena, there's a huge problem with who is exactly responsible for the side effects that are going on. A lot of studies have been done using, say, unselected subjects, undergrad students, and certain researchers are consistently successful in these studies, and there's a lot of suspicion that it's actually the experimenter who's responsible for the effect and not the so-called subjects. So perhaps by looking at physiology, if there's some correlate in physiology with a successful psi task, that might help identify that it's not, in that case at least, the experimenter, and it's actually the so-called subject. And then it might be possible to trace psi-related information through the brain and body with our neuroimaging, not only EEG, but perhaps with fMRI, and that would be pretty cool. So, RPK research with electrophysiological instrumentation. That's the project I'm working on right now. If we're going to get acquire physiological data, it's going to be by electronic means. That's the way it's done. I mean, yeah, it used to be chart recorders, and I'm going to show you an example of that. Even that was an electronic amplifier. So we want to not only measure the physiology, but identify a PK event. And most likely that means using electronic instrumentation to identify the PK event. Some of the challenges that I'm facing developing instrumentation for doing that is that EEG is notorious for things like movement artifact. We're going to have this person sitting there fairly quietly. Don't want a lot of eye blinks and muscle movement. It's really not going to be good if they're holding the object like bending a spoon. It's going to require repeated trials and accurate timing. And it's boring, let's face it, it's in a way. We need to resolve a PK event within seconds. So these are some of the constraints I'm dealing with instrumentation for measuring a PK event. Just to give you a little bit of background about PK sensors and what's been done in the past. For my money, that's a really good PK sensor. That's true. You cannot get two twists like that in a spoon using just force. The stem's going to break. So it's a pretty good indicator that something paranormal has occurred. The problem with the spoon in a EEG study is what I was just talking about. We really can't have this person hanging onto a spoon and bending it and think we're going to get clean EEG, no muscle artifact. And so perhaps it's possible to use a spoon as or a piece of metal as a detector if it's sitting away from the body, not being touched. The problem with that is that previous studies, which I'll tell you a little bit about, the attempt to instrument a piece of metal undergoing a PK bending event has not really been successful. There have been attempts to look at, say, currents running through the metal, none were detected. It's all sort of after the fact. If you look at a paranormally bent piece of metal, it looks like it was what they call warm-formed, as if it had been heated up. But there are also cases where it looked like it was cold-rolled as well. So as a dynamic event being measured with electronic instrumentation, metal is not a good candidate. To give you just a really brief history of PK research or events over the years. So we all know, I mean, people have been reporting PK type experiences since forever. But a really interesting one occurred in the Middle Ages. It was a person named Joseph of Cupertino, a Catholic saint. He was a notorious levitator. It was so bad, in fact, the Catholic Church was embarrassed by the guy. They were constantly shuffling him off to different monasteries. And the word would get out that Joseph is levitating, and the crowds would start showing up. I guess he was the middle-aged version of a rock star. Another example of psychokinesis, poltergeist agents, and reports of poltergeist-type activity has been going on since forever as well, involving things like showers of stones, moving objects. We had a poltergeist agent down in Durham years ago. It was a teenage girl in the lab, and screwdrivers and wrenches and even fire extinguishers were flying around. So that's an interesting one, kind of hard to instrument electronically. Another famous levitator was the physical medium D.D. Home in the late 1800s. For over 25 years, D.D. Home manifested all kinds of psychokinetic events, including large tables moving, objects moving. He himself levitated. This was observed by tons of different observers, including very eminent scientists of the time. Sir William Crookes actually did measurements of the weights of tables that D.D. Home was apparently affecting. One of his favorite things was to make the table so heavy that nobody could lift it. And Crookes actually verified that the weight of the table was changing, becoming heavier. So that's probably one of the first examples of PK instrumentation. D.D. Home also did some pretty wild stuff, like manifested disembodied hands playing harmonicas, some kind of musical instrument, I can't remember right now. You know, it was so outrageous that mainstream science, of course, was horrified by it. and shoved it under the rug with the excuse of, well, there are some fraudulent mediums we know, so therefore all mediums are fraudulent. And let's just forget about it. And that's the way the case remained for many years. There are some other examples of PK research, but it really wasn't until the 1940s when J.B. Rhine moved the research into the laboratory that things started picking up again. And of course, I think everybody knows about Rhine's research. In the PK area, it was done with dice and coin tossing. He was able to show that some people at least can score way above chance on these types of events, activities. In the 1960s, Helmut Schmidt and Ryan's lab moved the PK research into the quantum area by using radioactive decay and electronic noise as sources for randomness, which he then was able to show that some people are able to move these events off of their expected random statistics. He also started what's known as observer theories, with the idea that these events are occurring because they've been observed, which kind of fits in with the quantum theory. And Pear Lab at Princeton picked up on this, amassed a really large database over the next several decades. Unselected subjects, electronic coin tosses, random event generators. They had overall highly significant effects. For our purposes, random event generators aren't so great though, because the effect size is really pretty small. It's about 1 in every 10,000 bit flips can be attributed to PK. And so it's pretty smeared out over time. And we need something that's localized in time. So we're not really wanting to use random event generation for our PK instrumentation. In the 70s, in England, the Israeli psychic Uri Geller came upon the scene. It was on British TV showing how you could bend metal. And all these British school children home alone from school in the afternoon saw this and started bending their latch keys. It became quite a phenomenon, and it was noticed by a British physicist named John Hasted, who collected some of the latchkey school kids, as they were called, in his lab and started studying metal bending. And he got into instrumenting it by to the metal keys with the idea that perhaps it would be possible to see with instrumentation the beginnings of the metal bending before it's actually visible. At first, they had the kids holding onto the keys, and resistive strain gauges are pretty susceptible to electromagnetic interference. They're not hugely sensitive as well. Eventually, he started hanging the keys up, and his most talented kids were able to start showing signals on the strain gauges without even touching them. And eventually, he got to the point where they ditched the key and just started using the strain gauge as the target. And this evolved into the next generation of detector, which instead of using the resistive strain gauge, which, as I mentioned, is not very sensitive to the actual deformation, things moved into the realm of piezoelectric force transducers. A good example of a piezoelectric force transducer is the crystal phono cartridge in old-fashioned record players. So these devices are considerably more sensitive to force or deflection. They're generally made out of some sort of synthetic crystal material. But another example of piezoelectric material is quartz crystal. If it undergoes just the slightest deformation, it produces a charge on the surface of the crystal. That's what piezoelectric means. These are some examples of piezoelectric force transducers. The one on the left, the blue one, is a crystal phono cartridge element. The one in the middle is a synthetic piece of quartz taken out of a ham radio oscillator crystal. And the one on the right is a bender element. It's specially designed to be extremely sensitive force in one direction, that is perpendicular to the long axis of the device. The actual bender element, is right here. This part is the connector into the amplifier. So we were using devices like that years ago at Duke. We actually built some force detectors. The attraction of it was that you could get an actual calibrated force. So if a signal appeared, we could say, oh yeah, look, it's X number of newtons, at Y frequency, and here we can really, we've got a handle on PK. We can tell you all about it. And we built 4-channel detectors like this. We have this one actually adopts right now. And we did get some results. Unfortunately, they didn't happen very often, but I want to show you one because this is really cool. So this is on the old-fashioned chart recorder, the paper chart recorder. It had 3 channels. The bottom trace, the bottom trace was the target channel. So it was a piezoelectric element, like that little blue one I showed you in the previous slide. It was hanging up in a clear glass cylinder, so that the PK agent could see this thing, focus on it. There was a second channel, this one. It was another piezoelectric element. It was attached to this big marble slab upon which the whole experiment was resting. And we had to put these things on marble slabs, which were resting on top of inner tubes. They were the poor man's equivalent of a vibration isolation table. Because if you think about it, you're measuring force, and if you turn up the gain enough, you're going to start measuring somebody's dropping a pencil up on the 3rd floor, or the train a half a mile away. There's all kinds of vibration and shock in the environment, and that's actually one of the downfalls, I think, of direct force detection for PK. But nonetheless, we tried to get around it by having a second control channel out of sight glued to the rock. And then the 3rd control channel on the top was a electronic capacitor, which was the equivalent capacitance of the piezoelectric detector. That was there to pick up electric fields. So, if we get a signal on this bottom channel, and you see something happening on the second one, you can say, oh, that's just environmental vibration. Or you see something happening on the 3rd one, oh, that's just some sort of electric field. Maybe they produced it paranormally, but nonetheless, it's an electric field effect. What we're really looking for is something showing up on that bottom channel and nothing on the top 2. And this is exactly what happened one night. We had a person come in the lab. She sat in there for about a half an hour, and suddenly something started happening on this bottom channel. Now here, this all looks very black because the chart speed is slow, so you're not seeing much detail of the signal. We had to do that because the paper would pile up every half an hour. So we're running at slow speed. Well, as you can see, suddenly this big signal pops up right here. It's just about the time our PK agent says, oh, I've managed to transfer energy into the target. I sped up the paper so we could get some detail. And here's this nice big fat signal showing up and nothing on the other 2 channels. So, this went on for a little while. Here's some pretty good detail of it. The predominant frequency was 10 hertz. Now, I don't know if that's something to do with PK or her PK, or if it's just that the bandwidth of that system we were using kind of peaked out around 10 hertz. Nonetheless, we were getting a big signal, and that went on for about 10 minutes or so. She finally got up and left the room, and this thing stayed activated. She went back in the room. I slowed down the chart. She goes back in the room and says, I'm going to pull in my energy back out of this target, which she started doing right in here. And you can see the signal amplitude went down when she did that. So that was really amazing. We thought, oh God, we have got it now. Back then we had this old-fashioned brass polygraphs, 6 channels, and she was all gung-ho. Came back to the lab, wired her up, okay. And we tried that again 6 more times. Never got another PK signal again. And I think part of the problem is psychological. It just went from being a fun sort of event one evening to now it was an experiment. And that is one of the biggest problems in laboratory Psi research, I think, is the psychological factor. And that's why when Joe Gallenberger said, come on down to MC² with your instruments, I was like, okay, this is great, because You know, I know folks at MC Squared are interested in what they're doing. It's got some meaning for them versus in our lab where it's going to take somebody who can do this stuff and they don't care if it's got any meaning or not. We haven't found anybody like that. So, give you a little bit of idea of what I've been doing lately. I decided to see if we could make better PK instrumentation and how to do that, what to do. I just started maybe shotgun type approach. And this is really theory-driven research. You know, how can you make a better PK detector that's not based on a random event generator? We're talking about looking more at macro PK and not event than micro PK, which is what they call PK that's based on random events. So it's back in the realm of macro PK. Force detectors, now we know what the problems with those things are. I decided to just take a shot at this and instead of using thin wafers of quartz that have a lot of piezoelectric response, maybe use a big fat piece of quartz because quartz has got all this mystique built up about it. And you know, maybe there's something about quartz that make it a little more susceptible to PK influence. And on top of that, let's take quartz and hook it up to a really, really high impedance amplifier. We're talking the latest in integrated circuit technology. This stuff is so good, you're down to measuring the tiniest minute charge, almost hundreds of electrons type event. So we're combining really, really sensitive charge measurement with big chunks of quartz. Let's just see what happens. I put these things together on specially designed circuit boards. That's a later version that's got the dual channel. Used independent voltage regulators, blah, blah, blah. Try to control everything possible, get these things acceptable. Put them in shielded boxes down here on the lower right-hand corner. See those little black boxes? So each one of those has one of the cards just showed you with the dual channel in it. The little white box in the center is a magnetometer for picking up magnetic fields. Reason being that we can get pretty good shielding in those middle boxes for electric fields, but low-frequency magnetic fields are extremely hard to shield against. So if there's something going on with magnetic fields, we want to know about it. We have a magnetometer. This was set up in an experiment I ran at a healer place in La Madera, New Mexico. And that's a whole other story because he crashed the entire system. It's another one of the dangers of this kind of research. Here's the setup at MC Squared. I think this was the first time we came down. Those are little black boxes, and yeah, you know, quartz cubes, they're still a little bit susceptible to vibration artifact. And the way I was mounting them made it even worse. And you're running highly sensitive charge detectors, just the slightest movement can pick up some vibration artifacts. So we mount this thing on a little marble slab on some pillows to damp out the vibration. And you can see those cables are running to the back there, and right behind the pillar is a little, pretty big white box. That's the amplifier digitizer. That thing's kind of like a Sherman tank. It's so well shielded, we were using those in the MRI. So I thought that would be fairly immune and keep it sort of far away from the other boxes, and maybe the PK effect is not going to get into the rest of the electronics. I mean, come on, in a way, this is a lot of guesswork going on here. And then connected to the white box by fiber optic cables, a laptop computer that can show real-time display of the signals coming out of these devices. So we set up at MC Squared. Oftentimes I'll use a target, which is set up in the center. That's a sealed glass tube with a piece of brass foil in it. It gives folks something to look at and focus on and use as a target. I've also used plants, human beings, whatever. That night we were using the foil. Folks would come in, sit around in a circle, and Joe Gallenberger would lead people through various exercises. And Patty was there for one of them as well. Two, you were at all three?
I'm always there.
At
least two.
Yeah, that's right. Now I think about it. Okay. Eventually, the system evolved into a double shielded arrangement. I started putting these black boxes into a second shielded box. And this is a commercial RF shielding box. Combined together, double shielding like that gives you 130 dB of shielding. In other words, it's over a factor of 1 million reduction in any external electrostatic field getting into these boxes. And I'm going to show you in a minute why that's important. So for the first MC square, we had the little black boxes, maybe the second one. The third one, we had this big one. What happened was I got all this system up and running initially. I was expecting to see continuous signals like the one I showed you from Duke. And I put this equipment through all the usual electronic testing on the bench, verified the bandwidth, the sensitivity, blah, blah, blah. I knew what it was supposed to do. I would occasionally see these pulses appearing on my prototypes on the bench, and I thought, these things are so sensitive, it's just a loose wire or something. I get everything together, soldered down, and it'll go away. Well, they didn't really go away in the finished version, and I couldn't identify what they were, but they're only showing up about once every minute, maybe twice a minute. Didn't think it was that big a deal. We can get around that. We're looking for the continuous signal when the person zaps the detector, right? That's not exactly what happened. So the first experiment I did was a remote viewing experiment with Monroe. And he was down here. We had our equipment set up in the shielded room up at Dobbs in Charlottesville. And I asked Joe to remote view what was on the countertop inside our shielded room. Of course, Joe had no idea what was going on the countertop in our shielded room. I'd said this experiment, the little black boxes. He had never seen those. So during the time while he was remote viewing, we're running the monitor. I'm looking at that and I'm saying, oh, these little pulses are showing up. How annoying is that? And I decided to check the rate, pulses, and during the time that Joe was remote viewing, the rate was significantly higher. And then after the remote viewing was over, in the baselines, the pulse rate went back down again. So it's like, okay, I don't want to do random events, but here's something that looks interesting. So I took the whole system over to a healer's office in Charlottesville. And during the healing session, pulse rates go up. Plus, they seem to occur just at the moment of something really significant happening, like the healer's hitting this block, and there, oh yeah, and boom, 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 these pulses show up. I mean, this is all anecdotal, of course, but it's suggestive. Another thing we started noticing is you get pulses coming in groups. Now, early on in the experiment, I would have maybe one quartz channel, and the other 3 channels were other things, because I was trying to experiment with different materials and see, is it really quartz, or can it be something else? And, again, the whole idea of quartz, aside from the mystique of quartz, is that there are a lot of reports of people having things like their computers fail, and they feel like, this is something I'm doing, and one easy way that a computer can fail is if the quartz crystal that's running the clock and the computer gets jimmied somehow by psychokinesis, that computer's going to crash. So, quartz just seems like a really good candidate. But nonetheless, I would have other materials as well. But when we would run systems of quartz or other cube-like substances together, we would often see these events where you get several pulses coming close to the same time, but not exactly the same time. Now, if they all happen exactly the same time, it's, this is an environmental effect of some kind, or an artifact in the instrumentation. But in the time frame on this chart we're looking at, pulse number 1 on the top and pulse number 2 on the bottom are separated by maybe a quarter to half of a second. And then pulse number 3, this is another half to a second or so. And pulse number 4 is again delayed. Doesn't that look like something's kind of drifting through and whacking one after the other? You know, so at that point I thought, okay, maybe this is cosmic radiation. You know, I've inadvertently built an ionization chamber, a cheap version of a Geiger counter. And so we tested for that using radioactive mud. The system didn't respond to it at all. Another test for that is to compare pulse rates at, say, sea level versus high altitude. And I've got data that I took out west at mile high altitudes. Baseline data is no different. So it doesn't seem like it's cosmic radiation. And as I mentioned, we did all kinds of tests with electromagnetic fields, electric fields, vibration, you name it, sound. It's not internally generated noise. Check for that. So at this stage, we still don't actually know what's causing these pulses. And all I can say is that the main difference between this and other versions of piezoelectric push detectors is that the amplifiers are extremely high input impedance. Yes?
I just got a thought. Maybe measure it for a golden mean spiral measurement.
Okay, I'll have to talk about that later. Yes?
Just could you clarify what would happen to the crystal that would produce a signal? Physical deformation?
Classical piezoelectric effect would be a very small physical deformation would push some electrons out to the face of the crystal. So they're kind of floating around on the lattice, slight deformation pushes them out, and you pick them up with the electrodes that are painted on the face.
And are there other things, other than physical deformation, that are known?
To cause charge to appear on the surface of it?
Yeah.
That's the main one I know of. The rest of it was all just speculation. But
Yeah.
Some PK effect maybe is pushing electrons out.
But then when they work as oscillators, then
That's a mechanical, electromechanical effect.
it is.
So the size and the cut of the crystal,
Yeah, it resonates at a certain.
yeah, it's actually physically resonating. Yes?
I probably know less about this than anyone here, but I walked in a metaphysical bookstore at one time, and the ladies that owned it got all excited and wanted to test my energy, and they got out this little, to see if I could send it, and they got out a dowsing with copper rods with the little brown thing that held it in it, and they had me walk all over the store and send it, and it would pop out the copper rods, and they had me turn around backwards and pop them out, and so that was their simple means of testing if I could send the energy, and I could, it was easy, because they would hold them like this, and then when I sent the energy, they would immediately go pop out, and then it's like, well, am I sending it forward? Well, turn around and send it backwards, and you can still pop it out. So the copper, it was a dowsing tool of some sort, which I wasn't familiar with at the time, but...
Now, was somebody holding the rod?
Yes, they would hold it, and then I would walk somewhere, a lot of times even where I was separated, where they couldn't see me even.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, but
I've never been to Spoon, but...
Yeah. Now, see, the problem with dowsing for our purposes is that it's hard to get... Maybe we could wire up the dowser.
Well, yeah, because copper transmits...
And it's also something running through the nervous system with the dowser as well.
So you could test the... Yeah, you could... I don't know, that was just their, you know, we were having fun, and I walked in, and they were like, oh, let us test your energy. And I'm like, okay. So we just walked as far as we could apart and all over the store to see if it could pop out.
That's what we need is an electronic dowser.
Yeah.
Can I, again, so when you're doing these recordings, people are not intending to affect the crystals. They're doing a healing exercise or a MC squared.
No, we've got all kinds of experiments, protocols we've done. In fact, I'm going to get into that right now, so you'll see what's going on with that. But I want to tell you, there's a couple other signals that did finally appear on the system. This one I'm calling a type 1 continuous signal. It's got a lot of high frequency component to it, you can see from the sharp spikes. That appeared on one session that we ran at DOPS in conjunction with a plant. So
A plant like a green plant?
yes, a plant. So we have this poor.
energy to it?
No, I'll describe what happened. We have this poor little neglected plant sitting in the corner of the lab, and I wanted to target for a healing session. So I wanted to use the plant. And I pulled this plant out, and it was a mess. It was full of thorns and ugly stalks and whatnot. And not really a happy camper. I thought, well, this is a good candidate for a healing session. So I trimmed them up. I was pretty brutal about it and trimmed a lot of the thorns and whatnot off this plant and then set it up right next to the detectors. And about 5 minutes later, this stuff started showing up on the quartz channel. And it periodically happened throughout the experiment. This particular experiment, we had Frank DeMarco, who I'm sure people know here at TMI. He's been volunteering to come into the lab and be a lab rat, guinea pig, healer, whatnot. And we've got just a mountain of data that Frank's helped us generate while I'm fooling around with the electronics. He's very patient. So anyway, on this particular day, these signals kept cropping up during the healing session, and in the post-baseline, they were appearing once again. Finally, I just took the plant out of the room, and that stuff stopped. So, was it the plant? I don't know. I thought, well, maybe it's something in the electronics. I don't think so. It went away when we took the plant away. I tried to replicate this the next week, but I had trimmed that plant so brutally that the only thing left to take off was a couple little leaves. And I didn't see an effect. And it's really a whole other project that somebody could pick up on if they want. And of course, we know there have been other studies of plants and responses people have seen from them. And then there's one other continuous signal we have seen from the system. This happened at an MC squared event. On the bottom trace, this again was a quartz channel, you can see there's these kind of warbly, off-baseline movement. Normally, these signals kind of hug the baseline. They stay right in the center. You don't see this thing wander off like that. And that happened right when one of the MC squared participants was holding her hands up about 2 or 3 feet away from the box and trying to PK it. I watched this as it occurred. She's holding her hands up, maybe moving them a little, and this thing starts wobbling like that. You can see maybe this top channel's got a little bit of a wobble in it as well. And maybe one could say, oh, it's just a smaller version of a random event, but there's a lot of this baseline, and it just seemed to follow her hands precisely. Okay, so could say this is just static electricity. She's sitting on the rug, built up a static charge, got her hands near her, even though you got shielding. This is a really sensitive system. We're looking at less than 100 microvolts. Signal right here. It's just static charge. That's what the physicists would say. Get lost, Here's the problem. It was a dark and stormy night in late April. It was really damp and warm. I mean, there's no static charge going on. Okay, so nonetheless, it's possible this is some sort of biopotential. There have been studies done, like Elmer Green at Menninger, found that healers were building up volt-level charges, I guess, on their bodies. They controlled for static. And I think there have been 1 or 2 other studies done showing the same thing, that some people can build up pretty large voltages on their bodies. I went back and calculated what this would have to be based on the shielding and whatnot. She would have to have about 500 volts on her hands, I think, to get this as an induced electric field effect. And, maybe it's possible. In the same evening, Joe Gallenberg showed me the fluorescent tube stuff that they do in MC squared. And, he went downstairs where it was really damp, and it wasn't even a rug, it was just a tile floor. takes a round fluorescent tube, gets himself in the right frame, he's holding it and sort of flicking his hand, and that tube is flashing. Now, if Joe has got some sort of biopotential buildup on his hand, and he's flicking his hand like this, that would explain why you're seeing that tube light up. And, you know, it's not a charge. Joe tells me that people can use stuff in the shower with running water on them. So maybe, you know, that's an example of some sort of bioelectricity. And is that separate from PK? Or do people, when they're about to run PK, build up some voltage, biopotential in their body? I mean, that might be a physiological signal that we ought to be looking at. Stick a couple of electrodes on the arms, and instead of looking at microvolt levels and seeing the amp just saturated, thinking, oh, it's movement artifact, we're measuring at volt levels and suddenly seeing a signal. Okay, so to get down to the analysis, I had to give in and say, okay, we'll look at random events with this system at least, because that's a predominant signal that we're seeing. In order to do that, we have to identify the events, count them, calculate rates. I had generated hundreds of hours, I think, of data. We have to do it for every channel. We have to compare baseline to experiment. Yeah, this is awful. I didn't want to do it. We had an EEG tech in our lab starting to do it, and first time some other competing lab at UVA offered her a job, she took it. we lost her, and I was having more fun running experiments and doing analysis, and I just let the data pile up until finally this fall it was out of control. I had to stop all experimentation and buckle down, write some code to automate the analysis. So we started getting these event rates, and then used t-tests, which psychologists here know all about, to obtain some measure of significance, comparing baselines to experiments. I've got tons of data, as I mentioned, but I'm going to just focus on the MC2 data, tell you a little bit about that. I have 3 sessions taken over 2011 to 2012. Unfortunately, for data analysis, the protocols and the channels varied quite a bit across these sessions because we were constantly trying to, you know, push the evolution of this equipment forward. But we have all kinds of exercises that Joe is running, and we have also groups versus individuals. So the first thing I started doing was just pooling all this data together. Just separated out into groups and individuals, pulled across all sessions and all the significant channels. I got rid of any of the channels that were just deads, and it boiled down to some quartz crystals, some plexiglass chunks, and then 1 or 2 other channels. And you know, overall, for all the sessions together, I got a p-value of 0.001 for the groups and 0.013 for individuals. Now, what this means, p-values are indicating that the probability that the difference between baseline and experiment is due to random noise in your measurement or not. If you get it, the lower that p number, the more likely it is that your difference is not due to just random noise in the measurement. It's generally accepted that a p-value of less than 0.05 is considered significant. So here we're seeing a p-value of 0.001 for the MC2 groups, and 0.013 for individuals, which is significant. If I further broke this down into individual sessions and the most interesting channels. Interestingly enough, session 1 was not significant at 0.66. I really only had 1 channel that was functional that first session. It was a quartz channel, and it wasn't significant, but there was so much going on in that first session that seemed coincidental. We were running some of these exercises, and somebody would get all excited and yell at something right when they did kaboom, gigantic pulse would appear. So it was suggestive. It was enough to keep us going. Session 2, on the other hand, pulled across all channels and all experiments and subjects, 0.002, pretty significant session. They had enough experiments in there to break it out into individual channels. PC1 and PC2 were not quartz cubes, they were plastic cubes. QC1 and QC2 are quartz cubes. The only individual channel that was significant was one of the plastic cubes. But to be really careful about the interpretation of this data, because there's not a whole lot of it. So I'm just looking for trends here. I think the most interesting thing actually about this individual data is that pulled together, it's much more significant than any individual channel alone. That says to me, maybe start looking at systems of identical channels. That might be a more sensitive detector. Session number 3, significant. And that session didn't have plastic cubes, it had quartz and these single plate devices. And as you can see, one of the quartz channels is significant. So again, I don't think any of this is telling me quartz is better than plastic or anything else like that, but again, it's saying any individual channel is not as good as all of them pulled together. 0.013. So then I broke it down into the individual exercises, of which there were several. So we get the whole group together in the beginning, and Joe and Patty would be running folks through things like, okay, do a healing, do laughing, visualize energy, try to bend that piece of metal inside the glass tube, lots of different things like that. Each one of them would last maybe 3 or 4 minutes, some of them longer than others. And as I went through each individual exercise, a lot of them were not significant. However, they started getting close, and I've got listed the ones from close to significant up into significance. Healing came in at 0.13. It's not considered significant, but it's getting pretty close. I think the interesting thing about this is all the other healing groups I have tested, like Reiki groups, individual healers, healing groups in Santa Fe, New Mexico and whatnot, they all kind of come in at about the same number, around 0.1 something. So again, the caveat is I've been changing channels and stuff as we go. I think maybe if I got a really stable system and good protocols down, you'd see that number come down. I think that's interesting because that's a case where, as Jim was asking about, they're not really focusing on the detector. It's just set up in the room and the healing's ongoing. So it's sort of suggesting there's a field effect here of some kind when bona fide healing is happening. Okay, so the next one was energy. This is just a category I lumped everything into. Visualize energy vortexes, visualize energy zapping, all kinds of, anything with the word energy in it. Pulled all together, it's almost significant. And again, we get this same pattern where, you get a better P number when you look at all the channels pulled together than any individual channel. Now the next one, flowers. This is a really interesting story. This only happened in one of our sessions. It was an exercise where everybody was handed a big flower. It was all budded up. I think these were roses. So it was a tight bud. And the idea is to focus on that flower and make it blossom. So we did this with the equipment sitting in the room running. And I'd say, maybe about 10 minutes. And I noticed at the time there was a lot of pulses rolling in while this was happening. And some people got some really good blooms. Like this guy over here. His flower was completely bloomed out at the end of it. So even though I have very little data on that, I can't break it out into individual channels. I ran the analysis and it's significant. So I thought that was interesting because, okay, this is an exercise that has really maybe a lot of meaning for people because they're sitting and holding that flower. You know, it's a living thing, and it's kind of dynamic. It's blooming right in front of your eyes. So I thought that was cool. Then we get up into the individual. 0.013, as I told you about earlier, the same pattern. Pooled are better than individual. In small groups, oftentimes after the sort of formal session with everybody working together as a big group, we break up into these small informal groups, 2 or 3 people sitting around the sensors trying to whack them. And all the data pulled together from that showed it was significant. Individuals. This was single people sitting there. That's significant. Then we had small groups, significant as well. And the most significant of all is the large group activity, everything pulled together. And again, if you look at these individual channels, that same pattern holds up across the board. Systems pulled together seem to work better than individual channels. So, looking forward, what's happening next? I've been thinking about going into fashion design. Maybe not. And put together multiple channels of the exact same type of sensor. Continue to look into the biopotential. And as long as Joe and TMI will put up with me, I'm going to keep coming back to the MC squared and taking data. So, thank you very much. And, yes.